Hello again. The Practical Animal channel is dedicated to the public understanding of conservation, aiming to give students and career breakers tips that may just give you the edge you need to get that dream animal job. To meet today's guest, we go around the world via the Highlands of Scotland. Douglas Richardson is a conservation thinker talking today about life as a zoo consultant. He has worked in zoos all over the world, rising up through the ranks from junior keeper to curator, and now self-employed zoo consultant. Working in zoos with decision makers, living the wildlife looks like this.
Douglas, what's your best big cat fact, please?
Well, I suppose there's two. One's anatomical and one's more of a conservation fact. The anatomical one refers to lions, and people think, right, how many claws does a lion have? And it's, for as with all other cats, it's 5 on each of the front feet and 4 on each of the back, giving a total of 18. But lions actually have a spur on the tip of their tail, which when you actually have a lion's tail in your hand, you can feel it. So not a claw per se, but you can, other than their teeth, you could say that a lion has 19 sharp bits on its body. The conservation snippet is that, and this is where it kind of links the value of well-managed captive populations. There was a paper published in, I think it must have been about 2011, I believe. And they were looking at the genetic profile of both captive Amur tigers and wild Amur tigers. And it turns out that there are genetic haplotypes within the captive population which no longer exist in the wild population. And so for me, it kind of demonstrates that even if you are protecting a species to a point where their numbers are either remaining stable or even starting to increase, from a long-term genetic viability perspective, you may be coming up against a problem in the longer term where introducing genes from the captive population actually might be a key part of the species' survival. So extinction in the wild isn't a matter of, okay, there's no more of a particular species. They can become genetically depauperate. And I think that fact about the Amur tiger, I think, typifies quite a lot about species conservation in the 21st century.
What's your most treasured possession in your field, Kate Douglas?
These days, it is probably my phone. I've stopped carrying a notebook.
Douglas, what job opportunities are there for people wanting to enter zoos as a profession?
Well, I mean, certainly from an animal perspective, the obvious one would be zookeepers. Vets are specialist vets are another one. More and more zoos are hiring nutritionists and whatnot. Having people with other non-animal skill sets, but they enjoy and see the benefit of working in a zoo environment, and whether that's someone in the press office or whether it's a plumber or an electrician or a member of the education department. If they have a real interest in zoos, you don't necessarily need to be working with the animals to make a real contribution.
Douglas, how would you describe big cat conservation today and the role of zoos within it?
The conservation of big carnivores is probably amongst the most complex problems that we have in conservation. They're all relatively easy to manage in zoos. Managing a captive population of some big cat species or a bear or something like that is not particularly problematic. Taking that resource and then reintroducing it back to the wild, or helping to persuade people who live in areas where large carnivores exist, and zoos have become very good at getting complex messages across. I think that is always going to be the problem. You're dealing with animals that kill people. You're dealing with animals that kill people's livestock. If things aren't handled a particular way, the best laid conservation plans for this species or that species will come to naught. The lethal nature of these animals, if that isn't addressed, or things aren't put in place to actually minimize the risk, then the conservation project, wherever it may be, will inevitably fail.
What questions on big cat conservation in zoos would you like to see addressed by the close of the 21st century?
I think zoos waste a lot of their resources on species that no conservation import whatsoever. They're doing very well. One of the most popular that you see in virtually everywhere you go are something like meerkats, which are absolutely fabulous little creatures, amazing social structures, actually quite complex to manage long term. They are under no threat whatsoever. The application of resources, I think, really needs to be addressed, because those will always be finite, be it staff or funding or space. Zoos really do need to look very carefully at their collection plans and think, okay, do we need a film to tell us what animals we need to maintain, or an insurance commercial? Because I'm afraid a lot of those aspects of the media will dictate what many zoos keep, and it's not necessarily a good conservation choice. Getting to the bottom of that question of, all right, what is the maximum conservation role that any zoo can play, and realizing what that answer is and how best to go about it, I think is what needs to happen, and it needs to happen a damn sight sooner than the end of the 21st century.
Do you think things have progressed from Gerald Durrell's original vision of only having endangered species in a zoo, or if all zoos stick to that they won't be going far wrong?
There is an argument made that you need the general public. I mean, particularly in a UK scenario where the vast majority of our zoos get no funding from government whatsoever, unlike pretty much the rest of the world. We have to operate like businesses, and I accept that. But the fact, okay, well, we have to have these animals because that's what visitors want. I'm not sure that that is entirely true. What visitors want is active animals in facilities that look like they cater towards the animal's needs.
Douglas, you're a zoo consultant. Can you describe your work, please?
Well, I mean, it's incredibly variable. I'll get called to one zoo to have a look at their improvements that they might be looking at to their polar bear enclosure or their new tiger facility. I'll get sent plans to review. I've done a job recently for the zoo in Entebbe, and they got a World Bank grant for improving, I think it was about 6 or 8 of their major animal facilities. And so I was working with the design team to make sure that animal welfare was taken into account. Other zoos have brought me in to look at safety protocols, for particularly working big carnivores. Are the facilities and the working protocols as safe as they can be? Are they minimizing the risk to staff or the risk of an escape, which obviously can endanger the general public? And sometimes it's just this is what we're going to be feeding our jaguarundi. Do you think it's an appropriate diet? And it's a quick answer back in an email. So it's there's a lot of international travel, there's a lot of local travel, there's a lot of sitting at my desk, dealing with emails and reviewing reports and documents and plans. It's pretty much across certainly the mammal species spectrum.
How did your career develop?
Well, I'd always wanted to work in zoos, and I started as a zookeeper in October '75 at Edinburgh Zoo. But anybody who thinks, oh, I'd like, Doug's job, zoo consultant, I'd like to do that. Well, get 40 years under your belt and work in a range of institutions, ideally internationally, so you are actually better placed to deal with problems in different zoos. I mean, when I worked at London, there was some great people there, but they had only ever worked at London, for maybe 30 or 40 years. So they knew a very good solution, but they only knew one solution. Because I worked in zoos right the way around the world, I've dealt with a wider range of problems in a wider range of situations. Even, how lions are managed in Singapore as opposed to London, as opposed to Edinburgh, as opposed to New York is different, sometimes subtly, but it's different in every institution. So having a breadth and depth of experience so that you can go to a zoo and you can provide them with advice that is based on reality, so that you are a consultant that is actually worth the money you are paid. And believe me, many consultants are not.
Douglas, what things do zookeepers need to take into account with big cats in collections across the world? Singapore as opposed to New York. What things do they need to consider, especially if the animal's been brought in from the other side of the world?
Well, I mean, Singapore is on the equator, and New York experiences quite significant, or certainly used to experience quite significant winters. Is the nature of your facilities for the animal suitable for everything that the climate can throw at them all year round? Food supply can be very different. I mean, when I was working at Howlett's, we received a snow leopard from Chicago. In America, a lot of zoos feed their big cats on this minced, processed meat diet, as opposed to actual joints of meat or whole animals. And this animal arrived, and quite normally in quarantine, it can take a few days for an animal to settle. And we could not get the snow leopard to eat because it didn't identify an actual joint of meat or a chicken or a rabbit as food because it had never experienced it. So, as you say, animals can come from other parts of the world. Is knowing exactly how that animal was cared for and how best you can acclimate it to your local conditions, be they the facilities or the weather or even the diet.
What skills and personal qualities does a person need to be a zoo consultant?
Patience, an ability to explain yourself carefully and quite often to people whose first language is not English, or you're working through an interpreter who generally does not have an animal or zoo background. Being a good listener and being able to really understand a situation before you start, spouting off a load of things that you think they should do. Because sometimes I've been to places where they think they have a problem, and I've told them, actually, you don't. You're doing things. Things are absolutely fine. And that always comes as a little bit of a shock. But again, I think it's one of the things that's helped me is that I've always been incredibly honest with people. I've been asked to do consultation for one zoo that sticks in my head right away, that I didn't think they needed me. And basically, I turned down the money. I said, look, you guys are actually doing a terrific job. You don't actually need to hire me. I have since gone on to work for that organization many, many years later. But I think that level of honesty put me in good stead. Experience is key. If someone from the zoo community elsewhere contacted me for advice, I was always very free with it. I always thought, okay, that's how the zoo community is supposed to work. I ended up being a go-to person for many people within the international zoo community. When I went self-employed as a zoo consultant, I think all of that free advice, which I was quite happy to give, I didn't plan for it to pay off, but I think it eventually did, and that's why my zoo consultancy career has been as successful as it has been.
Which people or books or meetings have most influenced your thinking?
Well, I mean, certainly from a conservation perspective and the role that zoos can play, I think probably the two most influential people were Durrell, as you've already mentioned. He really sold the conservation ethic and the role that zoos and captive breeding can play. And the other one was Bill Conway, who was director of the Bronx Zoo when I worked there. He passed away quite recently. He took the conservation argument and molded it for major institutions. He was probably one of the first to actually start talking about having more specimens and fewer species.
What should candidates wear for an internship interview or a junior keeper position?
Some people might think that's a trivial question, and it's not. I assisted a small zoo in the south of England to hire a new zoo manager. I went through their applications. I was on their interview panel, and I was shocked and stunned by the number of individuals that showed up dressed like they just come from the gym. I was impressed, not a jot. And they would have had to come out with some amazing pearls of wisdom for me to alter my view of them, because I immediately thought, right, you're not taking this interview seriously, so why should I take you seriously? As it turned out, there was two candidates who actually interviewed the best, but it was two guys, and they both showed up in jacket and tie, looking the part, as people traditionally used to dress for interviews, weddings, and funerals. I think that's kind of the rule of those three events. You put your best bib and tucker on, and you sit up straight, and you pay attention, and you answer cleverly and coherently and correctly and honestly. But you have to look the part. You have to look like you want to impress. I think there's a lot of other messages that goes with if someone's taken the time and the effort to dress the part for something as important as the next job, potentially the next job in their lives.
Douglas, what are good questions that new entrants for an internship or junior keeper position can ask?
What programs are available within the institution for me learning more, becoming a more valuable employee? Is there a library? Will I be expected to publish? Will there be the opportunity to attend conferences? Will you have the opportunity in, ideally, hopefully financially subsidized to attend some of these meetings?
Is it getting harder to recruit suitable candidates, or easier, or staying the same?
In the post-COVID world that we live in, everywhere, including zoos, are having a hard time finding suitable people. It seems that many people, the idea of working a 5-day week is now something they don't seem capable of doing. Not everybody, but there is a significant minority. When I managed the Highland Wildlife Park here, if I had a vacancy on the animal department, which was pretty rare, but when I had one, I would get between 80 and 120 applications. I was at a conference in Portugal, and there was a discussion, and one of the senior zoo staff from a very good zoo in the Netherlands, we were talking about this, and he said that yeah, previously they'd get 50, 100 applications. Now they're lucky if they get 20. So there's something weird has happened, and this isn't just the zoo game. This is whether catering industry or offices or whatever. My wife works for the local authority. They had a job going in the council offices. They had one applicant. There's something very weird has happened since all the shutdowns and lockdowns from COVID.
What's driving that dynamic, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, certainly it's very surprising for something like for the zoo business, in that it's a sexy job. It has become really interesting. The competition was savage to break into, it always had been, to break into the zoo community. Now it doesn't seem to be particularly difficult to land a job in a zoo, which I think will begin to show in that, because there won't be that level of competition, the quality of candidate will diminish. But I can't begin to explain it. I really cannot.
Douglas, where do our knowledge gaps lie in zoo management?
I think there needs to be a new generation of bringing wildlife into captivity so that we can best learn how to maintain them. And the reason being that even if they're relatively common, or their species isn't under significant threat, it's better that we figure out how to manage them now than, say, as for example with the saola from Indochina, or the vaquita porpoise from the Gulf of California. Basically, we've waited until 2 seconds to midnight that is extinction before we actually consider, oh, right, geez, it's all going horribly wrong. We need to set up a captive program. And in the case of the vaquita, we didn't have the skills. And in the case of the saola, we can't find them. They may have gone extinct already. And this is an issue, I think, for the more wokish elements of the zoo and conservation community, that look at bringing animals in from the wild as some sort of ridiculously cruel exercise. And I don't for one moment argue that it's not without its stresses on the animals, but they seem to forget all the animals they worked with, where they all came from originally. But this is a necessary thing that has to happen, because as we know, and for many species, managing them in captivity will be the only sure way of avoiding extinction. Relying purely on conservation in the field, taking a politically correct approach to conservation, will spell the extinction of species.
Douglas, can you suggest a thesis topic or undergraduate research project?
Putting together an appropriate, at the very least, an appropriate bibliography of what published material may be available on this species, on a particular species, or related species, so at least give some kind of guidelines, or even trying to create a husbandry manual for that species, using whatever information is out there to try and distill it down into a usable document. I would suggest that those two approaches would be worthwhile and would give the conservation community a tool that can be refined. And it's much easier to refine something than it is to create it from scratch. So I would see, doing the bibliography or a husbandry manual would be of a practical project for either an undergraduate or someone new into the community, was maybe doing a keeper's course or something like that, and they needed to do a final project.
Have you got any advice that you can offer somebody wanting a zoo career?
If you want to work in zoos, make sure you know that is exactly what you want to do. Get a little bit of experience, maybe, and it might be volunteering in your zoo. I've known people that have come into the business that have never even visited a zoo, and they end up being quite surprised how things operate. So I think it's demonstrating that you have at least a modicum of understanding. You've got a little bit of experience, even if it is just from a volunteer perspective. But also, I would be familiar with the literature. You go to an interview knowing who Heine Hediger is, who Carl Hagenbeck is, who Bill Conway is, who Lee Crandall is. And if you do that, you actually demonstrate that at least you've got some background in the literature that's available, so which will also enhance your understanding of the profession.
Douglas, you are a zoo consultant. Thank you very much indeed for being on the Practical Animal Channel, Douglas Richardson.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.